All right, Buffs, ready for some more vocabulary? Today we're going to talk about angles. So let's start with the definition. It says a figure formed by two rays. So if we're looking at the diagram, we've got ray BA and ray BC. They have the same endpoint B, and it can be named three ways with three letters, such as angle, I just gave it away, ABC, CBA, with the vertex B, or with the number. And as I said, this is an angle. Now an angle whose measure is greater than 0 but less than 90, this is acute. An angle whose measure is equal to 90 is right angle. And you'll always see this little box in the corner. If you don't see the box, then you don't know it's right. An angle whose measure is greater than 90 but less than 180 is obtuse. An angle whose measure is equal to 180 is a straight line. The opposite angles formed when two lines intersect. The opposite angles formed. So in this diagram, we're looking at angles 1 and angles 3. Opposite angles 1 and 3 are vertical angles. Now we could have also looked at angles 2 and 4 are also vertical angles. Two angles that share a common vertex. In this diagram, here's our vertex, and a common side. So we are sharing this side here, but have no interior points in common. That means none of the points over here are the same as the points in this region. And these are adjacent. They share a common vertex and a common side, but no interior points in common. Adjacent angles. The next definition are two angles whose measure have a sum of 90. So the example is a 35-degree angle and a 55-degree angle, but you could also have two 45-degree angles. So they could be the same number, or they could be different numbers, so long as they add to 90. And these are complementary angles. Now two angles whose measure have a sum of 180, these are supplementary. So in the diagram we've got 120 and 60 which add to 180, but we could also have a 90 and a 90. That also adds to 180. Angles that have the same measure are congruent. Congruent angles. A ray that divides an angle into two congruent angles. Okay, so this ray in our diagram, BD, divides the big angle into two congruent. So we're going to say that BD bisects. It's an angle bisector because it cuts it into two congruent angles. Number 12, two angles that are adjacent and supplementary form a linear pair. An angle that measures 180 is a straight line. Two angles that are adjacent and supplementary are a linear pair. So I want to make one more little note up here on the supplementary and congruent. If we're thinking about the alphabet, we know that C comes before S in the alphabet. So 90 also comes before 180 if you're counting. So C is with the 90 and S is with the 180. Alphabetical order and numeric order. Okay, so let's practice. Take a minute and see if you can name this angle 4 ways. Well, with the vertex, angle B, and this is the symbol for an angle. Or we could say angle 1, or angle ABC, or angle CBA. And one other thing I want to point out is the vertex is always in the center. So these are the types of angle relationships. Let's start with vertical angles. Two angles across from each other on intersecting lines. So let's draw two lines that are intersecting and angles that are across from each other. Let's go ahead and just identify two angles. How about the top and the bottom? And let's name this angle 1 and angle 2. These are always congruent. So if the measure of angle 1 is 120, and I'm just taking a guess, then we know that the measure of angle 2 is also 120. Now a linear pair, these are two angles that are adjacent and supplementary. They form a straight line. So adjacent means they share a side, supplementary means they add to 180. So we know it's going to be a straight line and they're adjacent. So how about something like this? And we can, let's just put some numbers on here. Let's call this guy 120 and this guy will be 60. Supplementary angles, well, and complementary angles, C comes before S, 90 comes before 180. So if I'm looking at supplementary, they always sum to 180. So you could have an angle that's like 140 with an angle that's 40, as long as they add to 180. Complementary, they're going to add to 90. And so how about an angle that measures 89 degrees and an angle that measures 1 degree, as long as they add to 90. Adjacent angles, these are next to each other. They share a common side. Now they can be congruent, but they don't have to be. We could have two angles that are 45 and 45. We could have two angles that are both 20. Or we could have angles that are completely different. How about this angle that's 20 and this angle that's, I don't know, 68? As long as they have a common side. Okay, take a minute and see if you can answer 1 through 6. And just some warning, some of these questions have more than one answer. Okay, let's take a look at the answers. Number 1, angles 1 and angles 2. Do you see that they are formed by two intersecting lines and they're across from each other? These are vertical. They don't share a common side. I don't know about their measures. They are not complementary or supplementary. And they don't make a straight line, so they're not a linear pair. And number 2, now a couple of things to notice. This is a straight line, so we know it measures 180. This little box means 90. If we know that the angle on the left is 90, then the angle on the right, that is the sum of 1 and 2, is also 90. So we know that these are complementary. They are not formed by vertical or intersecting lines. They are adjacent to each other. They're not 180 and they're not a linear pair. In number 3, okay, we've got two angles, 1 and 2. Again, we have a straight line here, and the angle 1 and angle 2 are going to add to 180, so we know that they are supplementary. They also share a side and have no points on the interior in common, so we know that they are linear, and since they share a side, we know that they are adjacent. In number 4, angles 1 and 2, definitely next to each other, so they're adjacent. Vertical, not a chance. Complementary, we don't know. Without any sort of diagram, a little box or a number, we don't know what these measures are, and they're definitely not a linear pair. Now in number 5, we do know a little bit more because this guy has a box. So we know that this is a 90 degree. Here's our straight line. So that means these angles here have to be 90. Since these little marks indicate congruent, that means each of these angles, let me go ahead and erase the 90, are both 45 because 45 and 45 is 90, and we know that those little angles are congruent. Okay, so if angle 1 is what I'm looking at, and it is across from angle 2, and these guys are formed by intersecting lines, angle 1 and angle 2, we know that these are vertical. And if they're vertical, we know they're congruent. So that means angle 2 is also 45. Congruent means they're the same. And if we have two angles that add to get 90, they are complementary. They're not next to each other and they don't add to 180, so we can cross those others off. Last example, 1 and 2. Okay, we do know a couple of things. We have the little box again. So this is 90. We have a straight line here, so then we know that angle 2 is also 90. And it is across from angle 1. That means we've got some vertical angles. They are congruent, and since they add to 180, they are supplementary. Now they are not a linear pair though because they're not on the same straight line. So they're not a linear pair, they're not complementary, and they are not next to each other.